We're still falling!
You would be hard-pressed to find a D&D fan who hasn't at least heard of the Underdark. Those vast underground tunnel networks beneath the Forgotten Realms, inhabited by drow, mind flayers, deep gnomes, and intellect devourers. We've already visited the Underdark numerous times on this channel, and in multiple forms. And that's because most D&D settings have some equivalent to this magical underworld. From Menzo Berenzon to Eberron's Kyber and Dark Sun's underworld of somewhat questionable canonicity. And yet I can say with confidence that not one single D&D setting has an Underdark that is quite so quintessentially unhinged as the one beneath the surface of Mystara. Because, my friends, the Mystara D&D setting is entirely hollow, and there's a full-on second sun embedded inside of the planet. And even better, there's a whole video game about it. Mystara as a setting was first published officially in 1981, and as such is one of those OG D&D settings that predate the Forgotten Realms. Mystara originated as a shared universe created by players turned TSR designers Lawrence Schick and Tom Moldvay. There was a time in D&D history when two editions of Dungeons & Dragons were being published at once, Basic D&D and Advanced D&D. A decision was made internally that Gary Gygax's Greyhawk setting would become a D&D exclusive going forwards. Schick and Moldvay introduced Mystara from their home games to fill out the Expert D&D set, and soon it was accepted that Mystara would be the base setting of Basic D&D. Having started out as something more akin to a writing circle, and then getting thrust into the limelight, Mystara was kind of a straightforward fantasy setting that was built to be intentionally modular so that new lore and content could easily get written and tacked on. And this very quickly encouraged some very bonkers lore additions to an otherwise stock fantasy setting. After some retcons, Mystara was proclaimed to be the post-apocalyptic remains of the old Blackmoor setting. They also added a lore tidbit that one of the moons was transparent and ruled by eternally warring Indian and Japanese people who ride flying saber-toothed tigers around as a form of space travel. Listen, okay, I need to speak quickly. They're gonna try and stop me, but Japanese people, they're real. I can prove it. They live on an invisible moon. I'm not crazy. Don't back away from me. Hey, get your hands off me. The people deserve to know the truth. And lastly, in 1990, they added an entire additional campaign setting set within Mystara called the Hollow World. Oh yeah, this isn't just a quirky lore tidbit or a single adventure path. The Hollow World is an entire campaign setting with half a dozen published books. If any of this has captivated you thus far, and you'd like to try getting into the Hollow World or Mystara for yourself, then I'd recommend you make today's sponsor your first stop for content. Chepeku is a fantasy battle map maker for tabletop role-playing games. They're the top in the world, in fact. The length and breadth of their library is truly staggering, and that's good because you're gonna have to use pretty much all of it to the very far reaches if you aim to run a Hollow World campaign, because this is a setting of extremely diverse cultures and locales. We can grab maps like the Coatl Temple, Hanging Gardens, and the Jungle Temple for encounters within the Ascan Empire. Or, if we want to set adventures within the pharaonic lands of Nithia, we can pull from maps like the Ancient Stepwell or the Pharaoh's Tomb. There are so many strange and fantastic places within the Hollow World, and Chepeku is honestly the only map maker with a library large and diverse enough to accompany you and your tabletop groups down through the polar gateways. So here's how you're going to get access to this thing. You sign up at the Master Cartographer tier on their Patreon, and you'll gain access to over 4,000 hand-drawn maps, with multiple variations of each one, by the way. And you'll be signed up to receive the new offerings they put out multiple times a month. Higher tier patrons even gain access to animated battle maps compatible with virtual tabletops. You will absolutely wow your players with these things. Another big thanks to Chepeku for making this video possible. Now, let's get back to the video. Since we're going to break down the Hollow World for a bit before we touch on the video game by Westwood, it's worthwhile to acknowledge that Hollow Worlds aren't a D&D invention. They are, in fact, their entire own genre of fiction. Vast underworlds have existed in mythologies all across the world since time immemorial. But the genre as it came to be doesn't directly descend from mythology, actually. It descends from scientific theory. In the 1700s, early scientists were toying with the idea that the world might be hollow, and they were really working hard to see if they could figure out ways to determine whether it was or wasn't. And while today the Hollow Earth theory is rightfully known to be hogwash akin to flat eartherism, let's acknowledge that the theory at the time wasn't particularly far-fetched. I mean, scientists back in the 1700s couldn't have known how planets form, right? So how were they supposed to know what was at the core of the planet? Hell, we're not even good at knowing that now. As recently as a few weeks back, we discovered a big reservoir of water, triple the size of our oceans, trapped down there, saturating some weird rocks as though it was a sponge. So, in the name of fairness, it's not like the Earth is a sponge is any weirder of a reality than the Earth is hollow. Let's just be honest with ourselves. And honestly, sponge Earth was kind of an outside bet in the year 1700. The Hollow Earth theory was confirmed false in a pretty clever experiment in 1774. Keep in mind, I'm not a physicist and I may botch this summary. Scientists painstakingly calculated the volume and density of Mount Schiehallion in Scotland. They then placed a pendulum next to the mountain. Now, mountains are actually large enough that they exert some gravitational pull that ensures pendulums tilt towards them a small amount rather than pointing straight down at the Earth. Scientists were able to calculate, based off of the angle of the Schiehallion pendulum, the relative density of the mountain compared to the Earth. And what they found was that the Earth had an average density much greater than the mountain. And that bad boy is solid rock. So what this means is that the Earth, I mean, it may yet have some big caves and caverns down there, but there's enough dense matter that the planet could not be predominantly or substantively hollow if it had a greater average density than a solid mountain. Thus ended the Hollow Earth as a scientific theory, but it would remain as a pseudo-scientific theory ever after. It's a theory long past its heyday. Really, Hollow Earth's day as the vogue thing to be a weird uncle at Thanksgiving about was in the 1800s. The most important Hollow Earth truther of the 1800s was John Clev Sims, Jr., who was utterly devoted to the disgrace theory. He posited that not only was the Earth hollow, it contained even more hollow Earths. God, real-life sponge Earth is honestly so boring compared to Russian doll Earth. He would eventually give up on that part of the theory, but he had one more that would become his legacy. History would remember Sims for his hole. He thought it had a hole in it, where a pole should be. Yes, that's right. He believed that you could enter the Hollow Earth through the massive holes in the North and South Pole. Let's be honest, mostly because he didn't think anyone was going to go there and check. But then Arctic explorers did go and check. Nevertheless, these polar gateways would come to be an important part of this theory going forwards. Now, wacko theories like this tend to go one of two ways. Either people double down and start proclaiming that the lack of evidence in their theories are because of secret shadowy cabals, but the other way these theories tend to go is that people just start to accept that what they're actually doing is fundamentally just world building. And then they start to write really good books. And right these guys did, with dozens upon dozens of books about the Hollow World coming out over the last 250 years. Most famously, Journey to the Center of the Earth. Now, we could drill down even further into all the various evolutions of this genre, but that's kind of outside of my mandate today. We have all the component pieces of Hollow Earth, so now we can start talking about Hollow Mystara. Quick editor's note here. In the lore sections, I tend to like to draw art from the original books and make kind of a slideshow to speak over. In this case, there's just not a lot of holo art to work with, though. So I'm supplementing it with some outside art. Pretty much all of it is going to be from DC's Warlord comics, which features a very similar holo world. Mystara is an odd setting. The creation myths that everyone has there are all essentially wrong. Mystara has no gods, only ascended immortals. And none of those immortals know who made this planet or why. So our story begins with one of the very first immortals early on in the planet's history. How early? Well, I'm so glad you asked, because our protagonist today is a Tyrannosaurus Rex. No, T-Rexes were not sentient, even in Mystara. This one, however, was. He was a biological freak who had a brain so big that he also became a wizard. Our protagonist is a dinosaur wizard who ascends to immortality and becomes a god, and Just buckle up. This is gonna be one of those weird videos, man, and it's very front-loaded, okay? I was expositing for like 40 minutes in the Wraith video before we hit Ghost Godzilla. Okay, so this brainy T-Rex wizard is named... but more commonly this gets anglicized to Ka! Ka mastered his wizardry and ascended to immortality, only beaten to the rank by a few dragons and a handful of nature spirits. Being so early to the party and seeing the ages move on by and the species he was born to start to decline, Ka was eventually forced to stop his quest to obtain knowledge for its own sake and take a more active role in mortal affairs. Ka didn't think it was right to stop the world's progress, but he thought it was a tragedy that so many dinosaurs were going extinct. He began snatching up the last survivors with his little T-Rex arms and started hiding them away in caves below the surface. As he delved deeper, he realized that the planet's gravity didn't work like he thought it did. One would assume he discovered gravity at some point, probably after an apple hit him in his semi-truck-sized wizard brain. But while it would have made sense for the core of the planet's gravity to be the center of mass, the reality was quite different. His tunneling hit a gravity band all across the planet. Crossing it made gravity reverse. The band, as it turned out, was what was holding people tight onto the planet's surface, not Mystara's own mass. Curious as to why or what that meant, Ka kept digging and soon discovered that the planet was completely hollow. Mystara is a rock bubble. Ka saw an opportunity here. Preserving dinosaurs in caves was a pain in his colossally scaly ass. But maybe, just maybe, this hollow chamber could be used instead in order to house his collection in a more long-term way. Ka spoke to some of the other immortals and they all agreed it was a good idea, but that they should try and keep it secret from the immortals of entropy, who naturally take sort of a dim view of the idea of preserving things forever. One of these immortals created a new and eternal sun to light the vast inner world. A series of floating continents were placed in its orbit that were meant to act as a clock for the residents who otherwise didn't have any good ways to track time. To assist the Immortals' plans, they built vast polar gateways connecting the under and overworlds, hoping the entropic Immortals wouldn't notice the impossibly remote tunnels. A world was sculpted on the planet's inner crust. This wasn't meant to be a land by and for mortals like the surface was, though. The Hollow World was a collection of dead species and lost cultures. It was a zoo. With this as the plan, Ka and his peers built thousands upon thousands of massive valleys, separated by hostile oceans and unnaturally tall mountains. It wasn't intended to be airtight, though. The mountains contained a multitude of tunnels for the preservation of subterranean species and cultures, and this meant that it was possible to travel in between the valleys. Still, it was enough to keep areas separate, even if some individuals could still get through. The creatures down here weren't coddled by any means. Ka put them all in places where they would survive, but that didn't mean it was gonna be easy. Soon after the Brute Men, who were basically Neanderthals, were transferred to the Hollow World, the entropic Immortals caught wind of this second planet within the planet. And they Well, they weren't happy. They were devoted to entropy. All things must come to an end. That was the deal. And now they found out that all these creatures they destroyed fair and square had been stolen away and preserved forever. Now, it's not explicitly said in the lore, but by the sounds of it, they still didn't know about the polar gateways. So they weren't able to actually get to the Hollow World on their own to start, messing things up in person. Instead, they created massive, psionic, burrowing demigods and sent them plunging into Mystara's crust to wreak havoc on the world below. Upon arriving, the burrowers unleashed a plague of madness upon the brute men, convincing them to slaughter all they saw. Seeing all this, Ka and his faction hatched a plan. It was untenable to play whack-a-mole with every Lovecraftian burrower that the entropic immortals thrust into the soil for the rest of time. Instead, they opted to place an enchantment upon the Hollow World that would prevent outside influence from destroying what was preserved here. It also had the added boon of being really good at shoring up one of the weaknesses of their plan here. They called it the Spell of Preservation. This spell completely erased the mortal ability to assimilate outside of their own culture, or to meaningfully adopt practices from outside of their society. If you were a knight from the surface who had come here, it doesn't matter how many decades you spend with the Millennians. Your brain will literally never comprehend the concept of you putting on a toga. In implementing this spell, Ka ensured that the cultures he preserved would survive in their classic state for all eternity. Your language would stay the same. Your rituals, your traditions, they would all be frozen in place. Your society would stay the way it is, forever.
It's arrested development.
Unable to affect the minds of the locals with their otherworldly ideas anymore, the burrowers soon fell into a deep slumber. Now, the Spell of Preservation wasn't designed to overstep its authority and be a big problem for the mortals there. Ka has already demonstrated a few times in this story that he's got a lot of restraint with his interference policy. For starters, this wasn't a mind control spell, or a spell that forced everyone to, be racist to each other. It didn't make people hate each other's cultures or prevent them from being around each other. The book gives the example of an adventurer saving a lost tribe from their enemies. He becomes their leader, marries their queen, raises children in their culture, and is capable of engaging respectfully with the culture he found himself in. But he will never be capable of adopting the tenets of his new family. He'll wear his old clothes, observe his old rituals, and never once feel the need to participate in local cultural events beyond merely attending them. Secondly, it didn't remove society's ability to innovate or create within their own culture. For example, if we North Americans were preserved down there, the importance and emphasis on elements of our culture might shift over time. Barbecues could shift to become nearly sacred in their importance as a type of feast day. Then a few generations might pass, and now everyone is less concerned with barbecues and much more focused on obsessing ritualistically over which pair of sneakers is for each occasion. But this freedom within the spell was also its weakness. The burrowers, slumbering as they were able to use that leeway to claw their way back into mortal minds and sow chaos. The burrowers were able to subtly push cultures towards their most dangerous incarnations. Most critically, a burrower was able to seize control of the Ascan priest class through this method. The Ascans had always practiced human sacrifice to some degree, but it wasn't that big a part of their culture. Think of what we know of the ancient Greeks. There were a number of accounts of human sacrifice or three over the ages, but it wasn't like it was all that common of an occurrence or an obsession from what we know. That's about the level that the Ascans used to be at. But the burrower within their valley wormed its way into the minds of the priesthood and forced them to bring this minor practice to the forefront of their culture, soon revolving their entire government and military around the acquisition of sacrifices. Though the core book is clear that there are limits to a burrower's influence. This particular burrower is only in the head of a few hundred, maybe 1,000 leaders within the Empire. And this is largely the setup for the Hollow World. Isolated valleys filled with diverse ancient cultures, each artificially frozen to keep their culture intact. An eternal sun shines above, and burrowing corruptor deities slumber below. And from this premise, there's also a world of complexity going on in all of the individual societies and empires within the Hollow World. The game assumes that you're probably going to be a party from the surface who finds this place, one way or another. Which has this amusing side effect of the player's guide being kind of coy about how irrelevant its own existence is. Yeah, so here's how you make Hollow World characters, and yes, we know you're probably going to use the D&D basic rules instead to, I guess make characters from the surface, but you did pay for this book, so, thanks for the money, I guess, and you could make Hollow World characters if your main guy dies halfway through. Okay, thanks, have fun. It's a good sales pitch, 10 out of 10, no notes. We're now prepped to get into the Hollow World video game for the Sega Genesis, Warriors of the Eternal Sun by Westwood. And if you've been enjoying the video so far, please give it a like. If you're new to the channel, then hello, I'm William SRD. I cover video games related to tabletop franchises, and as you've seen, I like to go pretty in-depth with exploring the source materials that the games are about. We cover Dungeons & Dragons games across history, but we also deep dive World of Darkness, Warhammer, and more. If you enjoy what we do here, please consider signing up on Patreon. It's honestly such a huge support, and it really helps me to ensure that I have the freedom to make great videos, not just the ones the algorithm wants. And if you sign up there, I've also got a Patreon exclusive podcast. This month, we brought on a VTuber to have a truly whacked out conversation about the link between Blackmore and Mystara, while my co-host reels in horror. And in case you missed the announcement, this June I'm throwing a community event where we're all going to start a guild on the old Warhammer Fantasy MMO. Start date should be flashing on screen right now. Click the link down in the description to join my event Discord server and take part in the fun. We're gonna hold a vote in a few days to see which faction the community wants to play. Warriors of the Eternal Sun begins at the end of another story. The Goblin Wars are over, and the goblins have won. Our kingdom is overrun, and the last survivors of our homeland have crowded into a castle. The writing is on the wall as the goblins surround the keep. It's over for us. The Duke, not a man to die lying down, gives us a final battle speech. It's all rather inspiring, ride to ruin and the world's ending, etc., etc. It seems our culture is about to be destroyed. Does anyone else hear distant T-Rex noises? Now, somehow the castle lands right side up after falling into the ravine, which is quite the feat considering the weird reversed gravity situation. I told my friend about this scene, and he told me that it meant that the castle wasn't made of toast. And I told him, that's a good joke. I'll take it. It's mine now. It's going in my video. You made this? No, look at me. I made this. Anyway, title screen's been dropped, so let's make characters. I make the ideal adventuring party. 3 capable adventurers and 1 edgelord to hog the spotlight. Now, I did notably do something particular here that's a bit outside of the normal. I've played a number of games based off of old D&D on this channel, and the unwritten rule is that you're never supposed to make a thief character. They're not a very well-balanced class. While they do have some advantages in tabletop due to flexible role-playing and such, they don't have any of those strengths in CRPGs. We're talking pre-3rd edition here. After 3rd edition, rogues, thieves, and everything descending from them, they all work just fine. But after playing so many of these games, I figure I'm due to disregard that rule and to actually just suck it up and have a thief on my team. We'll touch on her performance of how well she did a little bit later on. Once we get in-game, we're told that we're the Duke's hand-picked people. The valley has been scouted by the soldiers, but they're now locked down to protect the castle. Our one and only job is simple. Find allies who can help us survive out here. We start exploring the castle before we dare to go outside. And let's begin with the obvious. This game, really nice to look at, right? The pixel work is stellar. Not only is everything extremely readable, it's downright vibrant and, dare I say, even cozy. This is definitely the style of pixel art games that modern games like Stardew Valley were aping. The result is that to a modern player, My god, this game just feels so comfortable and welcoming. That's a bit anachronistic though. Rating the graphics against its time, Eternal Sun looks somewhere between Ultima 6 and Ultima 7. It came out the same year as 7, which would probably put it just a hair behind the curve. Still, graphically, this game hasn't aged a day, especially when you compare the fact that the next isometric style graphics a D&D game got were the Dark Sun games. And that was clearly a downgrade from this. The music is complimentary, and it's got a good groove to it. There isn't quite enough of it, so it loops a bit too often, and it can change rather abruptly. But overall, it holds up very well, especially for the time. There's just a lot in this game that's lovable. Like the way your characters all go, yeah, when they level up, or the way that they start making YouTuber faces when they take damage. And it's actually very important that the game has all of these lovable elements. It's a grindy game, and without being so lovable, so cozy, the chores would feel like actual chores. We'll touch more on that later, but for now, let it be said, Warriors of the Eternal Sun is probably D&D's coziest video game. One of the first people we meet in the castle is our number one buddy and helper, the wizard Marmelian, who is inside his tower and thus faceless the entire game. We also touch base with the various shopkeepers and the priest, who is happy to resurrect and heal the party for free. There's also plenty of hidden rooms and chambers beneath the castle, and you can find a fair few goodies before you ever hit the exterior. Honestly, it's a simple but well-designed RPG town hub, and it's actually better than some of the hubs I see in modern games. As we step beyond the castle walls, I pretty quickly discover that, oh, yeah, the Hollow World? Pretty tough neighborhood, actually. We're given no objective beyond go get help, and otherwise sent out into this big open valley. And there's no side quests out here, it's just monster hunting. You're crazy weak at the beginning compared to your enemies. A data miner actually determined that the player party is given an artificial -2 to hit, and it's very painful, especially at the beginning. I could see via the map that I was clearly going to need to go to the far end of the map and check out those northern caves if we want to get any help. The thing is though, that the critters around the castle are more than a match for your party at start, and they get so much stronger as you venture further. Meaning, pretty much the first thing you do in Warriors of the Eternal Sun is grind levels. And you better get used to it, because you're gonna have to be doing that a lot as the game progresses. After some initial exploration, I spend ages grinding big enemies on the bridge until my merry band was a little stronger. Then, limping back over and over to the temple to resurrect my dead. Starting out in this game is very much about smashing your head into tough enemies over and over until eventually your party's competent. Fortunately, the game's pretty forgiving for having your characters knocked out. As I said, just go talk to the priest, they'll wake up. No lost levels, no EXP drain, it's fine. Now, the experience in this game is tracked by killing blows rather than being pooled or shared. And that means that XP can get condensed on your strongest characters very easily if you're not careful. I didn't know this at first, and I had to work pretty hard mid-game to catch my thief and magic user up in levels to my cleric and fighter. We begin a slow push north to the cave network, having to abandon the journey many times to return home and resurrect the dead who died on the way. Eventually though, we make it there safe and sound. I take a rest and we start cave diving into a bunch of these mini dungeons. It's not too bad actually. There's some easy bosses, some good loot, and a bunch of basic enemies to get through. Now, the dungeon system is absolutely fascinating. Overhead RPGs were the norm for this genre, but Ultima Underworld had just brought 3D dungeon crawler RPGs roaring into the mainstream. Warriors of the Eternal Sun and its sister game set on Mystara's surface, Order of the Griffin, came out immediately following the aftermath of D&D's Gold Box games. The Gold Box games were a run of critically acclaimed computer role-playing games by SSI, which was also based off of a hybrid engine. In the case of the Gold Box games, however, the first-person element was just the exploration. Meanwhile, the overhead isometric view was reserved for combat. They were well loved, but they got dated quite quickly, and very much overstayed their welcome. SSI was on the hunt for a new format to fill the place of the Gold Box. This and Order of the Griffin were the first two attempts, alongside Eye of the Beholder, which came out the year before. Eternal Sun is an overhead RPG in the overworld and a first-person dungeon crawler in the caves. You would think that this would be quite disjointed, with combat essentially being in two different engines, but it's surprisingly well done. Things mostly work the same, even if both modes have some differences, and in the end, it doesn't feel like these are two separate games by any means. Both modes do follow the same rules. The result was surprisingly pleasant on the consumer side of things, and it's a bit sad that they didn't continue making these hybrid games. Still, I would bet it was a pain in the ass for the devs to essentially make two versions of the combat engine, and as things went forward, it probably would have resulted in a lot of games where neither of those two modes had as much attention as they needed. Warriors of the Eternal Sun ends up stacking up quite nicely in a trial of its peers, especially when you consider it was a console RPG. But that's the general gist of the dungeons. They also differ from the overworld because you can't actually save. You have to do the whole thing in one go. You can rest, however, inside the dungeon, provided you've cleared out all the nearby enemies. So that's nice. I, on the other hand, would not discover that until tragically late in the game. Completing the mini-dungeons, our passage is blocked by vines, and we head back to Marmillion to ask for help, and to show him the strange artifacts that we found there. He tells us that they seem to be from ages in Mystara's past, and yet they look brand new. It's gonna take him some time to study all of this and figure out what this means. He gives us a magic artifact for the vines, though, slaps my edgelord on the ass, and tells us to get back in the field. The road back to the dungeon is thankfully much easier this second time. We're higher level, we've got better gear, we're better at using our abilities, so it's not a big problem. The dungeon passage on the other side of the vines, however, now that is a problem. It's very long, it's full of tough enemies and plenty of dead ends to sidetrack you, and to make matters worse, I made it extra difficult because I didn't know you could rest in the dungeons. After a few hours of making attempts, I make it to the other side to a coastline. And now it's time to make some allies. These guys look nice. Wait, no, stop, no, don't make me do this! Okay, so the lizard men, they attacked me on sight. We all saw it, so I murdered them. But maybe we can still smooth this over with the chief. No, that ain't it either, chief. Honestly, maybe for the best. D&D heroes taught me just how feral comment sections can be when we spend too much time with lizard people. Back the way we came, and no fast travel to speak of. But yes to respawns. We return to the castle. We're failures. Everyone's mad at us. Everyone's quite rude about it too, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit too rude. Something's off. Marmillion tells us that the Baron has started to grow a little stir-crazy down here. He actually has locked Marmillion up now, and the wizard has only kept his own wits about him by burning incredible amounts of incense.
What the fuck's up with this guy's pot anyway? He's supposed to be drooling and instead he almost makes us?
He's figured out what's happened to us, the truth of the hollow world we find ourselves in. We went back in time. Okay, you just go and have some fun with your little incense. I'm gonna go, and I'm gonna go. The lizard men earlier mentioned that there were other humans to the northeast, so let's be productive and let's get prepped and head over there. But first, I gotta fix my team up. That passage dungeon, that was hell. So it's time to rise and grind. I start performing a mass slaughter of green dragons in the far corner of our home valley. Finally confirming for myself that it's on a killing blow system, I'm able to start spreading the levels a little bit better and make a more capable party. It's at this point that I start theory crafting a bit about my thief. She's not good, rarely hits, does no damage when she does, and has no health pool to speak of. See, when I said that thieves were a weak class in old D&D, that's not really an opinion, it's part of the game design. See, the classes weren't balanced in terms of parallel power. A level 5 elf is just flat out better than a level 5 thief. And yet there was still a level of balance to this that is quite fair, and that's because experience points weren't symmetric. Different classes required different amounts of XP. You ever hear that old adage of magic users starting out as the weakest class and then they become the strongest? Well, that is to some degree true now still. It was much more significant in old D&D, in part because magic users also needed a lot more XP per level than the average class. You had to fight a lot harder and for a lot longer to get your little Raceland knockoff to be on par with everyone else. And when you finally exceeded them, you earned it. And the Thief was balanced to be a pretty weak class. But because it was weak, it would level up really quickly compared to everyone else. So yes, a level 5 elf is going to be better than a level 5 thief. But that's not how it's really going to be in practice. The thief in the party is going to be like level 7 before the elf hits level 5. And when you look at things that way, thieves aren't that bad. My mistake was not leaning into this from the very beginning. Because XP isn't shared, my thief wasn't getting any killing blows in comparison to the other characters who were at the same level at game start. So I resolved that my thief would at all times have to be one level ahead of the rest of the party. And it wasn't hard to make that happen because her XP targets were remarkably small. Once I managed to get her up to level and give her a decent weapon, she never underperformed again. Thieves aren't as weak as people say, so long as you ensure that they stay ahead of the rest of the team. We restock our gear and smash through that northern cave. It was about as tough as the last, but this time we're way better prepared. On the other side is a new zone, and great news! The Ascans who live here really want to be allies. All we have to do to seal the deal is step up to this neat obsidian altar in their temple. Of course it had to be Ascans, didn't it? One shudders to imagine how angry the Duke is going to be. I raid the temple because it's about the only thing left to do here, and there are so many traps. Good thing I brought a thief, right? We slay the high priest at the bottom. He's got 4 rings of fire protection, which look very convenient for crossing the magma fields in our home valley. We return home, and I'm a bit nervous to face the Duke again. He's naturally pissed at us. He has his guards escort us out and bar us from returning until I've found an ally for him. I wanted to do one final grind and use the shops before I left, so I reload and get to work. I decided to not go for max level before the end or buy all the top end gear because I just felt like that would be an excessive amount of grind. I got my thief to level 9, everyone else to level 8. It got a bit tough near the end, but it was all pretty doable at that level. Full of XP and the gold from dozens of fire dragons, we return home for one final stock up, noticing that the locals are significantly less sane than when we last saw them. Anyway, the Duke re-kicks us out, and we head to the fire cave. And the dungeon in there is kind of unceremonious. I expected there to be another zone on the other side like all the ones before, but instead we just kind of stumble across a secret wall, and there's an Oltec trader on the other side of that secret wall. We don't even get to say hi before they tell us, yeah, we'll ally with you in exchange for a trade route. Okay, I mean, that wasn't so tough. We return, finally succeeding at something, and we find the castle to be completely in ruins. The Duke beat poor Marmillion senseless and left him in a cage to rot before parading off into the forest to go be feral barbarians. Marmillion, despite it all, has got it figured out for real this time. We're in a zoo, ruled by a dinosaur wizard, and everyone went nuts because of a sleeping monster below the castle. Yeah, okay buddy, very plausible. He hands us the tools we need to access the final cave and defeat the burrower. We embark on our final journey, the last dungeon of the game. There's some big beasties down here, and near the end, I finally discover I can rest in the dungeons. I nearly flipped my friggin' desk, holy shit. The journey takes us down through a city of underground elves. Honestly, it was tricky. Would have liked one more level on my party. But I am nonetheless glad I didn't do another 3-hour grind to get that last level. At the bottom of this labyrinth, we find the burrower, and we read from Marmillion's scroll, and we summon something amazing. Dinosaur Gandalf has come to rescue us. Afterwards, I thought he'd give us a ride back to the surface, but No, we're Hollow Worlders now. Our civilization has died out on the surface, and this is our new home now. Our kingdom belongs to the goblins, but at least we have a nice bright future here in this valley. The Baron, free from the burrower's influence, apologizes and makes us each the head of our respective guilds to live in honor for all our days. There were a lot of problems with Warriors of the Eternal Sun. The burrower mind control was not particularly lore accurate. The coding was messy. That blanket -2 to hit for the players, that was incredibly unfun. And the grind of it all was just blatantly a means of artificially extending a very short game. Not to mention that for a game called Warriors of the Eternal Sun, where you're living inside of a dome with floating sky islands above your head, it is a bit silly that they chose a game format where you can't look up. Like, the only time you're in first person is when you're indoors. Why even do the Hollow World if we can't look up? I mean, what a waste. But despite it all, it's remarkably hard to think negatively about this game. Everything is just so lovable and cozy that it really manages to file off the sharp edges of the experience. Not to mention that the mechanics can get legitimately impressive at times. The healing system during rest is actually remarkably smartly coded, and honestly more intuitive than many modern CRPGs pull off. Warriors of the Eternal Sun is the coziest D&D video game, and I can see why it's remembered so fondly. We'll try out the sister game at some point later on, and we'll see if it's just as lovable. But in any case, thank you all for watching. I've got a run of really interesting D&D games lined up over this summer, and I'm also going to try and sneak in a bonus upload somewhere about an incredibly important game that nobody ever talks about. See you next time, everybody.